Before I get started, I need a volunteer. I'd like to volunteer you. I need someone to change slides. All you gotta do is just kind of hit the space bar. And when I give you a cue, and then that's all you gotta do.
Okay, which space bar do you want?
Oh, the space bar. It's the big long thing, a long narrow finger. Okay, you just do it like that. Yeah, just do it like that.
Okay, there we go.
Okay.
You whistle all.
I'll point at the yellow chair or sort of say, hey, you. Do it. All right, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much to the Kirkland Heritage Society for inviting me this evening. My name is Joe Follinsby, and I'm the author of Shipbuilders, Sea Captains, and Fishermen, the story of the schooner Wawona. What I'd like to do this evening is tell you some stories from my book. I'm a writer, and I'm mostly interested in the people who sailed in Wawona, who they were, what kind of experiences they had, and what their personalities were like, and so on. So I won't spend a lot of time on the vessel as an object or on restoration efforts. But, good. But first I want to mention one of the sponsors of this talk, Maritime Heritage Network. MHN is a collaborative effort by more than 80 maritime heritage organizations in the region to jointly promote their attractions and activities. It was organized by For Culture, which is King County's Arts and Heritage Agency, and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The website address is www.maritimeheritage.net. Slide.
Would that be in family or work as well?
Sorry?
Would that information be found in work as well?
That information is not in the book. So you have to memorize it. Okay, my talk is based on my research in the archives of Northwest Seaport, a not-for-profit that owns Wawona. The ship is now at Lake Union Park in Seattle. We're going to talk about Wawona's builder, 3 of her masters, and her fishing crew. We have a lot of memories of these men, and that's what interests me. Slide. Now, why is Wawona and her stories important? From a historical perspective, she is a direct tie to the first industries of the Pacific Northwest, lumber and fishing. She called at Puget Sound harbors and the ports in Grays Harbor. And during her fishing career, Seattle was her home port. Most of the fishermen lived in Seattle, though some lived in Anacortes and elsewhere on Puget Sound. Wawona has remained in Seattle for most of the past half century. But I think she's most important because her presence allows us to revive the stories of Puget Sound's maritime past and present. We all know how the region has changed dramatically in the past generation. A recent report found that about 1/3 of Seattle's residents, more than 166,000 people, did not live in Seattle before 1995. New people have come to the Northwest for opportunities in high technology, biotechnology, and other non-maritime industries. As a result, the Northwest has lost its tie to the sea as a primary source of its history and culture. Wawona is a singular platform for telling people about those ties, and it's a meeting place that celebrates that part of our community identity. This is Wawona's builder, Hans Detlef Van Dixon. Historian Harriet DeLong called him the sturdy Dane who built sturdy ships. He was born on October 14, 1842 in Thisted, Denmark, the son of a civil servant and his wife who came from a well-to-do family. I think there was a rebellious streak in him because he went to work with his hands. And as we know, in some circles, this kind of work was not for the upper crust. He learned shipbuilding and eventually found his way to Humboldt Bay, California, near Eureka. He founded his own shipbuilding company and built his first ship in 1869. In 1880, he married Emma Tagan, and I'll come back to her in just a minute. H.B. Van Dixon was an innovator in wooden shipbuilding. He was among the first to prove that Douglas fir was good shipbuilding material. Shipwrights back east scoffed at fir, which they called pine. It was too soft. They preferred oak and elm. But by the early 20th century, Douglas fir was accepted for its strength and durability. Van Dixon built a total of 113 ships, including the Wawona, which was launched on September 12, 1897. Wawona was built as a lumber schooner, which was sometimes called a drover. She could carry as much as 700,000 board feet of lumber and logs in her hold and on deck. You can see in this picture lumber piled on deck. The stack could be 16 feet high. Ben Dixon retired in 1901 and he wanted to move back to the old country. In early 1902, he boarded a train for San Francisco and a waiting ship for Denmark. But a friend's son fell ill in Eureka and he returned only to fall ill himself. He died on February 12th at age 59. His wife Emma lived another 52 years. She remarried and lived near San Francisco. The writer described her as a dainty little German woman, erect and spirited. She had a parrot named Polly, and she used to take the parrot for walks. When she died in 1954, at age 102, most of her estate went to the community of Thisted in Denmark. The couple never had children. Now I'd like to talk about one of Wawona's captains. She had 6, and this is her second master, Ralph Erskine Beasley. He was born on May 30th, 1866 in Jonesport, Maine. His father was a sea captain and his mother a librarian. He quit school to go to sea at age 14. He was a talented sailor. He got his first command at age 20. He arrived in the Pacific Northwest in 1888, probably to work for relatives in the area. Next slide. Beasley earned a reputation early on as a daredevil. One story says he took a 5-masted schooner up the Yangtze River in China when the river pilot refused to do so. Beasley had never seen the river before, so to take a large vessel with a full cargo up an unknown river was a huge risk. But he made it in one piece. He had a financial interest in success because captains typically owned a share of vessels or received shares of profits as well as a salary. While he was captain of Wawona, he owned 6.25% of her through a management group. Beasley believed in the hierarchies of land and sea. He was a company man. He reported dutifully to his bosses and expected his men to obey every command aboard ship without question. We know this from surviving records now in the hands of Northwest Seaport, which owns Wawona. Beasley didn't like unions because he thought they infringed on his authority. He probably used crimps, which sailors hated. Crimps.
What is it?
Well, crimps operated much like temporary employment agencies of today, except that crimps might beat and drug a sailor before dropping him on the deck of his next job. On the other hand, it appears that pay and working conditions aboard Wawona were better than other ships. The pay was around $50 a month for a sailor. Beasley had a life on land, though it seems to be fairly limited. In 1903, he married Burroughs Dalton, a bookkeeper at the Aberdeen Lumber Company and the daughter of a sea captain. They settled down in Aberdeen. He was 37 and she was 35, both old for first marriages at the time. He was often gone for as long as a year, but they often traveled together on Wawona. Mrs. Beasley was a quiet woman with a few friends. She and her husband lived in the same house for 35 years. They never had children, though she took care of her mother. Ralph Beasley was Wawona's master from 1899 to 1906. He was probably her captain when this picture was taken about 1900. It's Wawona loading lumber at the Port Blakely Mill on Bainbridge Island. About this time, Beasley met Peter Bernard Kine, who was a clerk for Dolbear & Carson Lumber Company in San Francisco, Wawona's majority owner. Kine was also a writer in his spare time, and when he read Beasley's voyage reports, he saw a perfect character for a book. Kine published a novel about 10 years or so after he met Beasley. The novel was called Cabby Ricks, or the subjugation of Matt Beasley. Kine based the character of Matt Beasley on Ralph Beasley. Here's how Kine described Matt Beasley. 6 feet 3 in his bare feet, 200 pounds in the buff, lean, lithe, and supple as a panther, and mere sight, his big lumpy shoulders, would have been sufficient to have quelled an incipient beauty. Nevertheless, graduate that he was of a hard school, his face was that of an innocent, trusting, good-natured, immature boy, proclaiming exactly what he knew his men called him, a big, all-around kid. Cabby Ricks told the story of Matt Beasley's run-ins with Alden P. Ricks, owner of a steamship line. The stories were morality tales with clear heroes and villains, wherein Beasley marries the boss's daughter and submits to his father-in-law's authority. The book became a series which sold hundreds of thousands of copies from the 1920s into the 1960s. Beasley became the most famous ship captain in America. Reporters would meet him at the docks and ask him for stories about his voyages. He would entertain them with down east phrases such as, "Hey, off the light," and "handsomely there, handsomely." I read one newspaper story in which the reporter never used his real first name, only calling him Matt, the character's name. Beasley was bothered by the attention at first and the confusion with the fictional character, but he learned that celebrity was useful. In fact, one of the last large wooden ships built in Washington State was financed in part because Beasley, the famous ship captain, would be its master. That's the ship pictured here. It's called the Vigilant. The other photo illustrates more of Beasley's personality. The woman is identified only as an actress, and that's how I describe her in my book. But shortly after I started these talks, an elderly gentleman came up to me and identified her as Joan Lowell, a Hollywood movie actress. She wrote her own book on how she was raised at sea by her father in the early 20th century. Beasley's last command was the sloop Linda for a trip up the Inside Passage with a crew of high school boys. They took pictures of whales during what I think was one of the very first whale watching trips. He retired around 1931, but he traded on his local celebrity in Aberdeen, such as running for sheriff and serving as a state liquor inspector. The day after Pearl Harbor, the Seattle Times reported that he had renewed his master's license, but he was never called to sea again. He lost Bury in 1941 and Vigilant, his favorite ship, in 1945 when it wrecked off the coast of Chile. He died in 1948. Now we're going to step back a few years to pick up Wawona's story. She was retired from lumber dropping in 1913 when she was bought by Robinson Fisheries of Anacortes and refitted to fish for cod in the Bering Sea. The cod was preserved in salt and sold in grocery stores. Wawona was one of several vessels based in Puget Sound that sailed to Alaska in the spring for cod. The industry started in San Francisco before the Civil War, but over the years the center of the industry shifted north to Puget Sound. It was a small industry. In 1915, 436 million pounds of salt salmon were produced, as opposed to just 57 million pounds of salt cod. One of the biggest mysteries is why salt cod producers kept using wooden sailing ships for so long when virtually every other fisherman turned to steam and then diesel. The answer seems to be that 1, the vessels were cheap and in good condition when they went to the market. 2, they had large holds that could be modified to add crew quarters. And 3, the salt actually preserved the holds, whereas salt damaged iron holds. This is a photo of Wawona at anchor in the Bering Sea about 1935. She's fairly low in the water, meaning her hold is about full. So this was taken in July or August near the end of the season. We know the approximate year because of the use of the triangular sail on the mizzen mast. It was first used in the mid-30s to keep her into the wind and anchor for more stability. And you can see a line of fishing dories trailing along her, or behind her on a painter. This is Wawona's 4th captain, Charles Foss, not related to the Foss family of Tacoma. He was Wawona's first fishing captain. He was born in Sweden in 1865 and emigrated to the U.S. in 1895. He was a master by 1908, working for Robinson Fisheries of Anacortes. He got the job as Wawona's skipper after he was wrecked in the Gulf of Alaska in 1912. One man was killed when the schooner Joseph Russ crashed on rocks near the Alaska Peninsula. Foss was a very superstitious man. He wore his wife's hats, the same patched blue serge suit, and he would stride the deck muttering, "Come on, old man, give us a wind." He also liked to race other ships. In 1934, he challenged the captain of the Azalea, a ship very similar to Wawona, to a race from Cape Flattery to the Bering Sea. The race was covered by the Seattle newspapers, and Wawona won by about 90 miles over a 2,000-mile crossing. Foss was a lucky man who almost always filled Wawona's hold, often making it the Highliner vessel in the cod fleet. A Highliner is a ship or a man who catches the most fish. I want to to tell a story now of how Captain Foss died. Foss's first mate was Torsten Haugen, who went by the nickname Tom. Tom Haugen was an immigrant from Norway who first signed on with Robinson Fisheries in 1918. He rose through the ranks and became Foss's second in command in 1928. The two men worked together for the next 7 years until 1935, when Foss's luck ran out. Here's how. To get out of the Bering Sea into the North Pacific, you go through Untitled Pass, a gap between two large islands in the Aleutian Island chain. Untitled Pass is typically very stormy with strong tides. On August 13, 1935, Foss and Haugen and the rest of the 36 or so crew were in a heavy gale when Foss stormed out of his cabin and complained about Haugen's handling of Wawona. He climbed up the companionway to the quarterdeck and yelled at Haugen, "I'll get her through." He took the wheel and slumped over and fell from the deck. Foss apparently suffered a heart attack or a stroke. Haugen ordered Foss taken to the roof of the main cabin and laid next to the skylight and covered with canvas. During the confusion and the struggle to keep Wawona going, a fisherman named John Eider stepped on Foss's chest. Out came a loud "woo!" and Eider yelled, "He's alive, he's alive!" And Foss had died. It's like, at first, Haugen asked the Coast Guard to take Foss's body. But after some back and forth with the Coast Guard, Haugen decided to bury him at Lost Harbor, near Untitled Pass. Lost Harbor was a frequent stop for Wawona on her way north in the spring. Haugen and the crew buried Foss just above the high tide line and returned to Seattle. A crewman recalled that the superstitious Foss died on the 13th, was carried to the grave in number 13 Dory, and was buried by 13 men. The next year, Haugen and his crew stopped at Lost Harbor, put a granite marker on the grave, and planted flowers and seeds from a maple tree. It's said that he and Wawona visited Foss's grave every year thereafter, as long as Wawona sailed. Next slide. The workhorse of the cod fishing fleet was the Power Dory. It was based on the classic design of the Gloucester Dory from New England. It had a flat bottom, averaged about 15 feet long, along the bottom and 18 feet overall. The major innovation in cod fishing was the addition of 3 and then 10 horsepower outboard motors. A wood and canvas forecastle head was added to the bow to prevent water from coming into the boat when she was at speed. The motor could do double duty as an anchor. There's a story of how a fisherman lost his anchor in a fog. As night fell, he removed his motor, took off the ignition plate, tied it on a line, and dropped the motor over the side. The next day, he pulled up the motor, reinstalled the ignition plate, and cruised back to the water. Excellent. Cod fishing was hard, dangerous work. The fishermen used 2 hand lines with 2 hooks, baited with fresh halibut or herring. They worked in water from 100 to 300 feet deep. Imagine lifting 2 fish at a time, each weighing 20 pounds or so, plus 10 pounds of lead weights from a depth of 300 feet. Do this about 100 times a day, twice a day, over 2 or 3 weeks if the fish are running good. Fishermen were paid by the number of fish they caught. This encouraged them to overload the dories, which could hold 200 or more fish. You can tell by this photo that some fishermen loaded their dories right up to the gunnels, and the smallest wave could swamp them. A fisherman named Nick Fields, who was Haugen's first mate and best friend, probably drowned in 1941 when his dory was swamped and capsized. All that was found of Fields was his dory and a bit of torn flannel shirt. The fishermen aboard Wawona and 3 or 4 other similar vessels that would accompany her to the Bering Sea were after the Pacific cod. The adult fish is about 2 feet long and averages 15 to 20 pounds. It eats everything from its own young to baby ducks, and it's kind of stupid. A minister on a remote Bering Sea island reported how codfish would crash through the thin ice from early winter sea, probably to fill their air bladders. When the fish landed, it stayed on top of the ice and froze solid. The local Inuit people collected the fish for a winter meal once the ice was thick enough to walk on. After the fishermen pitched the fish onto Wawona's deck from their dories, the dress gang took over. This was a team of around 10 men on 2 teams that headed, gutted, and split the fish for preservation. One of the team was called the spare man, and his job was to count the fish as they came in. An accurate count was critical for correct payment of the fishermen. The dress gang was paid by the pound of fish they cleaned. On a busy day, a ship could last 14 hours and as many as 10,000 fish cleaned. All the work was done by hand, with custom tools made aboard ship. The man on the left is Captain Haugen moving fish around bins called checkers. Next slide. After the fish was split, they slid down a plank to the hold and the salting curve. The fish was laid flat in layered piles called kenches. Of course, sea salt was dusted on the fish, and salting took some skill. Too much salt, and the fish would be too dry. Too little salt, and the fish would spoil. The hard physical labor of fishing required a good cook. This is Jean Bagger, who ran the galley on 3 Wawona voyages. Newspapers often published stories about the ships and their crews. Reporters would write about captains, highlander fishermen, and cooks, which gives a sense of how important the cook was to the whole enterprise. Bagger was up at 2 a.m. to bake bread and prepare breakfast, which he'd serve around 4 a.m. A morning meal would include eggs, pancakes with syrup, bacon, ham, biscuits with jam, and coffee. Fishermen could often tell what day it was by the morning meal. Ham and eggs meant Sunday, donuts meant Friday. Lunch or dinner early in the voyage might be beef steak, pork chops, mashed potatoes and gravy, boiled peas and beans, slices of fresh bread, a bowl of butter, apple pie, peach pie, and coffee. Later meals got more boring. Fried and boiled cod, and lots of potatoes. Wawona carried 7 tons of potatoes, 30 barrels of flour, more than 650 pounds of butter, and salt pork in 250-pound barrels. An inventory form lists 215 items. All the food for a 5-month trip was stored without refrigeration, although the food locker next to the frigid-bearing sea below deck was very cold. Wawona almost never made landfall for supplies except fresh water, which was stored in steel tanks. The fishermen enjoyed a fair amount of downtime, especially when the sea was rough and fishing unsafe. 30 men slept in bunks in the forecastle, not much bigger than an average living room today. A few fishermen made some extra money giving haircuts. If a man suffered from head lice, he would shave himself bald and rub his scalp with kerosene. I have a photo of about a half dozen men who went through this treatment at one time. The man on the right is Don McIntyre, who wrote a very detailed account of the 1936 voyage, which formed a major part of my book. He's enjoying his pipe, which he lost in the last days of the voyage. It was his favorite pipe, too. Hygiene is always a problem aboard ship on long voyages. Occasionally, the crew would hook a hose up to pumps powered by small gasoline engines and literally hose down their shipmates. They also hung their clothes on a boom and let the wind and rain wash them. This was called blowing out the stake. Another fisherman tells the story of hanging his laundry below the bowsprit. As the bow moved up and down in heavy seas, it dipped the clothes into the water. He said the result was better than any washing machine. Sailors would sometimes get together in the galley late at night for snacks and a sing-along. Some fishermen and dress gang crew brought accordions, mandolins, harmonicas, and they would keep time with spoons or just pound a steel pot with a knife. On the 1936 voyage, Wawona had a wind-up photograph. Around mid-August, Wawona would head home with her hold full of 300,000 split and salted codfish. The return trip would take 2 or 3 weeks on average, and she would unload her catch at the Robinson Fisheries dock in Anacortes. The fish would lie out of doors on tables called flakes to dry. In cooler weather, the fish would be brought indoors and dried in steam-heated industrial dryers embedded in Anacortes. Once the cod was fully dried, it was further processed and packaged. Here, women played a critical role. In the left photo, a woman is picking out small bones in the fish with tweezers. Picking out as much bone as possible allowed the fishing company to call it boneless. Note the bare light bulb at the top of the photo. That and window light was all she had to work with. The woman in the right photo is putting cut blocks of salt cod into cardboard boxes for final shipment to grocery stores. These are two examples of the old packaging for salt cod. The top one is tissue wrapping from Robinson Fisheries Company, also called Wawona. The bottom carton is from the Puget Sound Codfish Company, which was based in Poulsbo. The availability of refrigeration to households and changing tastes killed the salt cod industry after World War II. Puget Sound Codfish Company ran the last salt cod voyage to the Bering Sea in a sailing ship in 1950. It was one of the last commercial voyages by a sailing ship in U.S. history. That ship was the C.A. Thayer, now undergoing restoration in the Bay Area. Wawona made her last voyage in 1947, and she was moored in Lake Union for the next half century, except for a few years at the Kirkland Marina in the 70s. She was purchased in 1963 by a group of preservationists led by Seattle City Councilman Wing Luke. The group included Kay Bullitt, a member of a pioneer lumber and broadcasting family, and famed restaurateur Ivor Hagelin. This is a picture of Captain Hogan, taken in 1963 while a campaign to save Wawona was underway. The group wanted to use Wawona as a centerpiece for a maritime museum, but the idea never got off the ground. So how is Wawona doing at present, and what's her future? She is currently at Lake Union Park. The visitors are not allowed. Restoration work has halted for lack of money and a work site. I think it's ironic that one of her last visitors from the general public was Dave Wright, who sailed aboard Wawona in the early 1940s. He sailed on 3 of Wawona's final voyages. He came to Seattle in the winter of 2005 from his home island Cordes to visit Wawona and tell stories. He is one of only 3 Wawona fishermen left that I'm aware of. He's 88 years old. Soon he will leave us, and there's no guarantee Wawona will survive him. Now, since in the last few weeks there has been more news on Wawona, and you might have read something about it if you get the Seattle papers. Currently, there's a plan to take her out of the water. She's still in the water at Lake Union Park. To take her out of the water and put her on land in front of the Center for Wooden Boats. That plan is still being finalized. There's a whole bunch of players, such as the Army Corps of Engineers, the Seattle Parks Department, the Department of Natural Resources, and a whole bunch of other figures in the pie that have to sign off on it. And the other big piece is that Northwest Seaport and possibly some other folks who might help have to raise $2 million to create a display. But this is probably her final chance. It was determined that there was some thought that she could be moved to another location, and it was pretty clear that if they moved her, at least while she's still in the water, she would probably sink out in the middle of the lake. There is a plan, because she has to be moved sooner in the next few months because of work at Lake Union Park, to put her on a floating barge. The last date I heard for that to happen was sometime in mid-December, but those dates have been moved at least a half a dozen times over the last 2 years. So that's the current status of Wawona, and that's my talk. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have, and I have books over here, and we'll be signing books in just a few minutes.
Are you optimistic about it being saved?
Am I optimistic about it being saved?
I mean, realistically, you know all.
Well, there have been, I don't know, I've lost count how many plans there have been to save her since 1963, over the past 40 years. And one can't help but be skeptical about every plan that comes along, because it almost unfortunately, it's almost never amounted to anything. Mostly due to lack of money, as always with these projects. Everybody knows that money is always a problem. There's also leadership and organizational problems. Now, the Northwest Seaport is a little stronger now than it has been for a while. I was on the board for a short time in 1999, and that was a very near a low point. But it's now, how these things go with organizations, it's now on an upward trend. But having said that, it's $2 million is a big hurdle for that organization. So I don't know whether to be optimistic or pessimistic, frankly. I mean, a boat displayed on land, I mean, doesn't really make any sense. It's a boat, for Pete's sake. It ought to be in the water. That's where it lives. You know, that's where it did its duty, and that's where people lived on it. But if putting it on land is what it takes to keep it as an artifact to teach people about our maritime history, then, you know, that's what you got to do. So that probably doesn't answer your question. But I know, my fingers are crossed, but
Yes,
I'm not a gambling man.
I
so
realize you're
yeah.
hopeful and you'll be heartbroken if it isn't.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just
I mean,
wondering
this
if
is-
you're optimistic.
I think this is truly her last chance because she's in such a poor condition.
Why don't you tell Paul Allen it's a yacht and he needs to buy it?
Well, you know, that question comes up a lot. The question, if you didn't hear it, was, why doesn't Paul Allen help? And first of all, the way I answer that question is there is no white knight. There are no white knights. Anybody who's worked on any kind of significant heritage project knows that it takes a group of people and a coalition of funders, organizers, leaders, and so forth to make something of that kind, that size happen. To depend on a single individual to somehow come to the rescue is a non-strategy, in my view. And I'm not picking on you in particular, it's just I hear that all the time. And people got to get past that.
Has
This doesn't work.
anybody asked him?
I know there have been attempts to reach him. I know there have been attempts to reach him, but his, to be honest with you, his charitable interests have never extended to historic preservation.
Yeah.
Uh-oh, somebody's calling for grandma.
Who's grandma?
I gotta get that thing, so. It's not a grandma, it's grandma. Yes, ma'am.
How many similar ships have been preserved in the United States?
Only one?
Only one.
Well, okay. You mean by similar ships of the same type and design? Only one.
And
That's
age and so forth.
yeah. Well, let's see, there's a bunch of answers to that question. If you're thinking about very similar types built on the West Coast, only one other one. That's the C.A. Thayer in San Francisco. Now, if you're thinking more broadly about sailing ships and so on, on the West Coast, there are maybe half a dozen, but they're all much smaller. Wawona and the Thayer are by far the largest sailing vessels that have been preserved. The other sailing vessels, most of them are two-masted. There's all of them two-masted, with a few single-masts. You may have heard of the Zodiac or the Adventurous. Those are both two-masted schooners. Both of them were used as pilot boats originally, and also one of them, at least Zodiac, maybe both were built actually as pleasure craft on the East Coast, but they were also working boats too.
Oh, so they're still in the water someplace?
Yeah, oh yeah, Zodiac and Adventurous are used as sail training and environmental education boats, but that's their
So
main
this,
mission.
so the hull of the Wawona is just very rotten, is that
Yeah.
what you're saying? It's like,
Essentially, that's
well, it's too bad you can't just cut it off and put those sails on the land.
well, the idea was discussed, but masts without a hull doesn't make any sense, at least not to me.
Well, I mean, half a hull.
Well, I don't know, would you cut your house in half and save it?
I know, those sails are beautiful, aren't they?
What's the deal on the masts? I mean, they replaced them once, and then
They're
now
in
they're
condition.
down again.
Yeah, they're down, they had to be taken down because they weren't in their
It's not
seats
secure,
properly. They
or-
were secure, yeah, there was talk, there was a major windstorm, which of course we had last year. But they could come down and actually crash on property or hurt somebody, so they took them down. They're actually laying in the, floating in the water next to the hall. But what I heard was that, well, in fact, I remember when they took one down, the top 15 feet snapped off one of them, and there was rot in the middle, so, and they were put in there in the 70s, so they're well past their good working life.
Was
Yes,
Mr.
ma'am.
Foss the same Foss of, excuse me, Foss tugboats?
No, they're not related as near as I can tell. Foss is a fairly common Scandinavian name, like Smith.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, what got you interested in doing the story?
What got me interested in the story? I was on the Northwest Seaport Board for a short time in 1999. And actually before that, I knew about Wawona. I grew up here, or in Seattle anyway. And I knew that she was down there. And I had been gone for a few years to work, and I came back with my family, and I got, well, what's going on with her? So I went down to Lake Union Park, or at that time it wasn't even a park, it was still on my Navy. And saw her there, and one thing led to another, and I got involved as a volunteer, and during that time, I had learned that there were about 24 boxes of records of all types, photographs, diaries, letters, business records, and so forth, that were all in archive boxes properly assessed and the whole thing. And as I started going through it, it was amazing stuff, at least to me. There had been one other book written about Wawona that some of you might have seen, Harry DeLong's book, published in the mid-'80s. But it was more of a coffee table picture book, which is fine, nothing wrong with that, but I was more interested in the narrative, the storytelling, and that book didn't really get into that. So I kind of let it sit for a few years while I did other things, and then I applied for a grant, a special projects grant for culture, to write the manuscript, and wrote the manuscript, pitched it to 36 publishers and agents, and they all said thanks but no thanks. And then got another grant to publish it. Essentially it's self-published, but for culture paid for it.
Okay,
And that's what led to the books.
all right, thank you.
You know, you're saying it's too bad they're not out of the water, which is true, but
Right.
compared with losing it, because
Oh, yeah.
when you look at, well, up in Alaska, you know, or even the old Preston sitting up, you know,
Yeah.
you can still do something with it that way.
Oh, I agree. I mean, if
But I hear, I know some people, and they say if you see the setup in San Diego, that they're kicking it as too bad that this is going to end. Alan just wants a big press park there, and they said all that's going to do is have all the bumps out.
consider how the city of Kirkland overall, I'm sure that, their record has been helpful to you. And of course, there have been bumps in the road. But over in Seattle, the city of Seattle has actively worked against saving the ship. It's night and day. And the fact that there might even be a land display is a huge victory. In part because the land that they're talking about isn't owned by the city. It's owned by the DNR. So the city doesn't really have any control. They don't have a whole lot to say about it. I mean, they have a role, but not quite as much as a landlord might.
Tell them it's a strip club, and that'll get through the constable over there.
Sorry?
Tell them it's a strip club.
Tell them it's a strip club, yeah.
All day.
Right. Or tell them, we'll build a trolley next to it, financed by, Hotland or something like that.
Yeah, give it to the other bums, the secret pirates.
Yeah.
They're missing part of
And you
it.
had another question, didn't you?
I was just gonna ask you, how much would it cost to build a whole new ship with the same design?
Well, I don't know the answer. I can tell you that the restoration of the Thayer, which is it's only 2 years older, same shipyard as the sister ship, was $12 million. But building a whole, just a copy, a replica of it would probably cost less. Several million, I'm sure. But then she'd be a copy and not the real thing.
Oh, yeah, it's just,
folks who run Lady Washington.
Oh,
And we all know, she's just gorgeous, and but not to take anything away from her, she's a replica. She's built with an engine. And, the Coast Guard requires all ships now. There's no sail only large vessels. You gotta have an engine. And while that, that's a conceit that we have to, because it's 21st century, we have to do that. It's not the real thing. It's fun, it's great, it's educational, but it's not the real thing. It's air science, almost. Yeah.
I always miss the Wawona on Halloween because in 77 and 78,
Yeah.
it was right here, it was the haunted house.
Really? Oh, you know what? I know that because I remember seeing there's a flyer in the records
Oh.
that says has something about Halloween on it. Because that's in there. I can't.
Do we have a copy of that someday for our records?
Oh, well, you'd have to ask Northwest Seaport. It's not mine, it's theirs. But yeah, I remember distinctly. I don't know what year it is, but I remember that
Well, it was
there's at least one.
77. Our dog was a baby, so it was 77.
Oh, yeah.
78, and then I think in 79.
There's a little drawing of a pumpkin on it and shit.
That was a horrible, it was frightening.
It wasn't frightening.
It
It was wonderfully
totally
frightening.
disgusted with it, but it was wonderful.
Cool.
I don't miss it.
Well, it's kind of scary every day now.
It was open, it was stairs were open.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
little
yeah.
rats would be down, I don't know what kids were doing it, and they would grab your ankles as you went. Nothing you can do today,
Flooded ship. Yeah, that's great.
Didn't it sink or?
It's actually sunk a couple times at its birth. And
As soon as
they
it
just
left
pumped the water. They just
her,
had a salvage vessel pump the water out.
as soon as it left her.
Yeah, it was like
Very
80 or
first
81.
year. Very first year.
Yeah, first
All
year.
restoration work was done inside
Right. Well, as you know, anybody who owns, a house, you get water in on wood, it just rips it up. That's what's happened to the wall. Yes, sir.
Do you know what the latest is on the clock now?
What's the latest on the Kalakna? Well, I don't keep in touch too much with those folks. I check their website every once in a while, and it never seems to change. The last I heard, she's still in Hannibal's waterway. Beyond that, I honestly haven't heard anything. The big news that I heard, this happened, maybe a year ago. She got listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Yeah. That's the main thing I can remember.
We didn't hear where you said she is now.
Oh, in Tacoma, Highlands Waterway in Tacoma. Yeah. It's on the northeast shore of Pennsylvania.
Two wonderful ships.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I'll be happy to sign those for you right over here with you. Christmas is coming.